This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, well, we'll make a start then. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Butler, who's here today taking part in a lecture series on the subject of liberalism in the Americas, which has been running since October 2011. We kicked off with a lecture by Brandon back then, and have had several lectures in the series between now and then. The Liberalism in the Americas project as a whole is a comparative examination of political culture, economic policy, social development and intellectual culture across the Americas in the 19th century, looking at the impact of liberalism in all of those different fields. Today we've had a small group of us have had a workshop on the relationship between liberalism and religion, sometimes compatible and often very fraught. And this evening Matthew's lecture is going to be examining the issues around that theme as well in the context of post-revolutionary Mexico. So Matthew is an associate professor in the history of modern Mexico in the Department of History at the University of Texas in Austin. Before that, he taught at Queen's University in Belfast and the University of Exeter, and did his original studies in the University of Bristol. So he's back visiting us on these shores for the moment. Most was sort of main book to date has been on popular piety and political identity in Mexico's Cristero rebellion in the Michoacan region, and is currently working on a book that sounds incredibly interesting, Father Perez's Revolution, on making Catholicism Mexican in 20th century Mexico. And so today's talk is on the revolutionary religion and relationship between liberalism and Catholicism in post-revolutionary Mexico. So I'll hand you over to Matthew, and then we'll have some questions and discussion after he's finished.
Okay, well, many thanks, Deborah and Dee, for this invitation. It's allowed me to come home. Alas, the weather's not improved in my absence, but many thanks once again. So I'm going to try and gloss the topic of revolutionary religion fundamentally through the prism of the schismatic revolutionary church, which was founded in 1925. I want to begin with a quote, which is taken from the State Department records and written in 1928 by the US Consul at Veracruz, a man called Harold Wood. And Wood really had heard that some unusual religious developments were taking place in rural Mexico. He also knew that at the time of writing, public worship was suspended across Mexico as a result of a feud between the episcopate and the Cádiz government. This in turn had generated a fierce bout of religious persecution in a Catholic revolt known as the Cristero Rebellion. In any event, Wood had learned that a schismatic body calling itself the Mexican Catholic and Apostolic Church was busily proselytizing in the indigenous countryside. And I quote, "Clergymen of the Mexican Catholic Apostolic Church have been conducting services at various towns. It is said that the bishop and his priests are not graduates of any theological institution, but are agents of the Mexican government sent to conduct services in order that the government may say there is no religious question in Mexico. Nonetheless, Mexican Catholic clergymen have conducted services such as baptisms, confirmations, and masses with great success. This, Wood said, was because Veracruz peasants were in the same intellectual stage of development as at the time of the conquest," another quote, "and were not concerned with questions of dogma or whether the services be conducted by Roman or by Mexican Catholic clergymen." That's an intriguing document, not least for Wood's racializing trope that national questions were beyond the comprehension of benighted Indians. Unwittingly, however, Wood did capture two important points. First, that the revolution was a period of genuine religious as well as socio-political ferment. That's something still not fully appreciated, even after 15 years of Mexico's new cultural history attacking 1910. More specifically, I think it can be argued that the roots of Mexico's so-called new religious economy, pluralist, driven by the competitive supply of religious goods, can in some ways be traced back to 1910. If nothing else, as Edward Rios has recently argued, the revolution opened space for religious actors to renegotiate their positions within Catholicism. Second, in returning to Wood, the consul had glimpsed in the schism a more two-way relationship between Mexico's liberal and Catholic traditions. He attributed evidence of this to ignorance, Yet he saw that the revolution included a significant and popular religious experiment, somewhat like the French revolutionaries' Église constitutionnelle. That was somewhat perceptive in that few contemporary assumptions about Mexico's revolution were more common or proved more enduring than the incompatibility of liberal revolutionary and Catholic worldviews. In the same vein, many historians also see the revolutionary schism as a partial ploy to split Mexico's Catholics, like a kind of Henrician tragicomedy. Yet I will argue most things that are commonly supposed about Mexican Catholicism, that it was urban, ephemeral, ultimately secularizing, just an imposture, are basically wrong. Rather, the schismatic church enjoyed localized but genuine support in several hundred villages in the Mexican countryside. It also tapped into a deep vein of ecclesiological radicalism dating from the late colonial period. This tradition of constitutional Catholicism was historically intertwined with Bourbon regalism and later with Mexican liberalism, but it originated within Catholicism itself, meaning that constitutional did not only denote within the state, but involved an additional appeal to the Church's own federated conciliar constitution. In its Mexican incarnations, this tradition aimed to purify Catholicism in the national interest and strip away clerical abuses, and to recenter the Church within a national episcopal jurisdiction, in keeping with primitive Church history, so it was said. The schism was a case of ecclesiological remembering in some, as well as political machination. It looks incongruous not just because of revolutionary meddling, but because of what Oakley calls an overfamiliar, high-papalist historical narrative. In contrast, Mexican Catholics' counter-narrative traced the lineage back to the patriot churches founded by the likes of Melchor Ocampo in the 1860s, to the Gallicanism of the nation's founding fathers like Father Mora and Fray Servando, to the calls of 18th century prelates for a return to primitive church discipline, and even to the indigenismo of Las Casas and others. A reformed church was thus an established feature of Mexican radicalism, and the revolution was no exception, except that its particular vision of patriotic churchmanship also involved appeals to more revolutionary-style social engineering. This reformist impulse was shrouded in some low religious politics in the 1920s, but I insist that it was still there. For one thing, the cry for reform was now made by an ancient soldier priest and veteran of Porfirio Díaz's 1876 rebellion, the self-proclaimed patriarch, José Joaquín Pérez. And Pérez's movement was certainly partly political. He stormed the Soledad Church in Mexico City in February 1925, for example, violently reopened the debate about the meanings of Mexicanism and Catholicism just 3 months into the Calles presidency. The bloody schismatics also received protection from Minister of Labor Morones and his regional confederation of Mexican Labor, CROM, and thus indirectly from President Calles. So it's easy to dismiss the schismatics as pawns of the regime, which is a somewhat exaggerated claim in my view. Certainly the schism did ruin relations between the Roman Catholic episcopate and the regime, lighting a fuse that would explode with the Cristiada in July 1926. But many revolutionaries too were enraged by Calles' tacit endorsement of a national church, so much so that in April 1925, the Caudillo Obregón warned Calles to back off or risk splitting the revolution, at which point overt backing for Pérez stopped. After the first 100 days or so, the schism thus had to fend for itself. A supportive bureaucratic context, possibly an informal religious corporatism of the kind recently identified by Jason Dormady, was all Pérez really got from the regime. Instead, his movement developed really on a petitionary, bottom-up basis as hundreds of villages appealed for him to send priests to continue their services, especially in the context of the official church strike of 1926 to 1929. Most defecting priests also came from an identifiable clerical substratum, denoting some old divisions within the clergy rather than a proverbial rotten barrel. Among the elites, only the archpriest of the Basilica of Guadalupe showed interest in the schism and even discussed his defection with Interior Minister Tejeda before getting cold feet. Most schismatics, however, were poor auxiliary priests, what in Mexico are called curas de misa y olla, priests who celebrate Mass for their supper, who were at the mercy of their parish priests. Others were deacons or seminarians who had been punished because of their liberal reputations. So you can say that at least the first wave of schismatic clergy were members of what David Braden calls the clerical proletariat, and they tended to welcome Pérez's promise to improve their lowly position within the church. Pérez's church is also filled with genuine congregations of Indians, agrarians, and peasants. Again, I suggest that this village appeal implies that there was more to the schism than mere manipulation, and and leads us to questions of institutional hegemony and popular political or religious negotiation within the church. In geographical terms too, the schism was distinct. It was clustered in a dozen or so central, southern, largely indigenous states, the Federal District, Guerrero, Hidalgo, but far more notably in parts of Mexico State, in Puebla, Tlaxcala, Veracruz, Oaxaca, and also Chiapas down south. In shorthand terms, therefore, schismatic Mexico provides a mirror image of cristero Mexico. It maps pretty well onto Alan Knight's three-way division of a pink, indigenous, relatively unchurched Mexico, a red Protestant impious north, and a white ultra west, where the cristeros call the shots. Of course, that's a typology that needs a lot of refinement. Revolutionary side Catholicism did not sprout everywhere, or for the same reasons, even in the South. The schism's political utility to local political bosses, to agrarian leaders, to local clergies, and its compatibility with popular variants of liberalism and patterns of local festive religion, all influenced the take-up of Mexico's revolutionary church. So too religious relevance to material and especially agrarian questions. A history of Mexican Catholicism can therefore offer insights into the relationship between religious and political commitments in post-revolutionary Mexico, given that church-state tensions in the 1920s and 30s typically forced people to choose between their religious convictions and their material needs. Peasants who took government ejidos, for example, tended to be excommunicated by parish priests. Pueblos that harboured cristeros were denied land. There were political and spiritual limbos involved with people who mixed up those categories of citizenship and faith in the context of post-revolutionary reform. The difficulty for us in most cases is that the spiritual bargains required to transgress these categories leave little trace. The schism is significant then because it meshes diverse elements of popular culture, including Catholicism, peasant patriotism, agrarianism, anti-clericalism, and various other elements. It shows us how popular actors pursued an integral vision of revolution that made room for their religious beliefs. It shows us how people became adept at playing churches and at playing church and state off one another in order to safeguard what they viewed as their essential religious and other interests. From his cathedral in Corpus Christi in central Mexico City, Perez imagined that ICAM was a pristine church inculcating simple pieties and patriotic civic virtues, yet very few village schisms copied this template faithfully. Instead, we find that Mexican Catholicism was metabolized in line with local and even ethnic interests. In many ways, in fact, the schism was a Franciscan reprise, a small network of parish priests traversing the countryside on horseback, indulging local devotional taste and then riding on to the next village. Were it not for the juring principle, the swearing of constitutional oaths, and the promotion of agrarian reform, probably 16th century evangelists might have recognized the basic itinerant model. For campesinos in these communities, Mexican Catholicism served a variety of purposes. First, it was a way to end the disenfranchisement that often came through participation in revolutionary reforms like land reform. Secondly, after Roman Catholic priests left their churches in protest against Calles' anti-clericalism in 1926, the schism re-enfranchised villages that had basically been deprived of their public religious outlet, particularly at the time of the village annual fiesta. Thirdly, the schism gave the village or a specific faction monopoly control over religious capital, parish icons, the church building, arms that were collected at the feet of sacred icons, and so forth. Fourthly, it deepened an emerging revolutionary agrarian identity, or shored up an ethnic identity, gave it a kind of sectarian edginess. And lastly, the social implications of Mexican rights, which were performed in Spanish for free in a somewhat emancipatory spirit, were themselves more or less libertarian, and especially when it came to revalorizing local devotion. Fifthly, there was an additional lastly, the schism allowed pueblos to advertise their loyalty, their political loyalty to the regime in a context of very, very high church-state tension and political violence. So in sum, a commitment to religious innovation should make us wary of claims that the schism was merely political, and more broadly, that liberal revolutionary anti-clericalism was simply a secularizing genre. On the contrary, the schism suggests that some revolutionaries believed they were engaged with Roman Catholics in a struggle over religious purity, a religious struggle. Their anti-clericalism often had a somewhat apostolic character, not putting the church out of business, just forcing it to clean up its act and to revert to spiritual basics. That was the basic message. In some, this was a confessional anti-clericalism that sprang forth internally, and its main supporters were dissident or liberal Roman Catholic priests and Catholic revolutionaries. That maybe is not the contradiction that it might seem. As René Ramon's classic study tells us, anti-clericalism only makes sense in a religious system which, like Catholicism, makes a separation between the sacred and the profane, the clerical and the lay. For Raymond, that affirmation of orders makes anti-clericalism a positive ideology, not simply a negative phenomenon. He also argues that anti-clericalism in moderate form rejects only a particular kind of clerical, ultramontane Catholicism, not Catholicism per se, and that it seeks to make the church pristine by removing the corruptions and accretions of the centuries. In this regard, we find that Perez's acolytes also invoked the golden age of early Christianity and used this model to attack Rome's usurpation of Christendom. Rome's departure from early church practice led it to abandon its mission that set itself up as a worldly interest conspiring against the Mexican nation. This anti-clericalism, of course, paralleled the official revolutionary reading of Mexican history, in which the clergy enfeebled Mexico and oppressed its people, just as it came from a more prelapsarian view of the church rather than from the secular mythology of the regime. Rome was suspect because it fleeced the national flock, but also because its basic religious claims to authority were bogus and a betrayal of scriptural teaching. In contrast, the schismatics intended to create a church expressing Mexico's spiritual unity and furthering its revolutionary destiny. This involved the transfer of spiritual capital from Roman Catholicism to a revolutionary religious community, but also a radicalization of Catholic religion itself. On the one hand, Perez promised to restore primitive church discipline and ground ecclesiastical authority in the nation. On the other hand, he promised to transform Catholicism, getting rid of backward practices such as religious taxes, liturgical Latin, preferment of Spanish priests, all these things which he thought held back the progress of the Mexican nation. In some, revolutionary Catholicism was conceived as an affirmation of what the church had been or ought to be. Core ideas included a belief in the harmonious coexistence of nations and churches, a federated constitutional Catholicism, and confidence in Catholicism's revolutionary potential. Again, this suggests that the revolution generated degrees of religious mobility and transformation, not just institutional conflict, as Catholicism was reworked alongside other basics. Indeed, in some places we can see that Mexican Catholicism became part of a confessional political identity which mixed local religious, ethnic and revolutionary practices. That was sometimes a pragmatic identity, as we will see, and it didn't always become permanently enrooted because in 1929 the regime sold the schismatics down the river as it made its peace deal with Rome. While it lasted, however, ordinary people joined the schismatic movement in small but significant numbers to create an autonomous, supposedly egalitarian religion, to acquire an ethical weapon in factional and agrarian disputes, or to maintain their traditional festive religion. It bears repeating in the context of this event about the historic dialogue between liberalism and Catholicism or religion in Latin America, that this restorationist rhetoric was something of a staple in the context of the Mexican Revolution. It was an ingrained feature of revolutionary ideology. If we look at the writings of the Constitutionalist lawyer Luis Cabrera, who was a Catholic from liberal Zacatlan in Puebla, the arch-ideologue of the Constitutionalist Revolution in Mexico, we find in his essay from 1915, La Cuestión Religiosa en Mexico, a first synthesis of liberal revolutionary ideas, perhaps. Cabrera's starting point was a Mexican specificity, a country so Catholic, he wrote, that there was no counterweight of any kind to the influence of the Catholic clergy in religious matters. This fact shaped Mexican liberalism and forced the likes of Juarez to place the church in an apparently unfavourable and unjust condition, he wrote, not really separating church and state, but depriving the church of the ability to own property, abolishing religious orders and so forth. In the current situation, 1915, Cabrera argued, it was essential too to distinguish between the revolution's real objectives, which were simply strict enforcement of the reform laws of the 1850s, and the deplorable anti-clerical incidents which he alleged resulted from Catholic hostility to the revolution. If constitutionalists occasionally interfered in purely religious matters, he wrote, as when they publicly burned confessional boxes, at bottom, for Cabrera, the revolution had no other goal, I quote, than to place the clergy within the limits of its proper faculties and its spiritual mission, making church-state separation effective. Cabrera's last argument focused on churches themselves, ownership of which the reformers of the 1850s had transferred to the state, while their use alone is reserved to the Catholic Church. Now, I should point out that nowhere does Cabrera actually evoke a schism. Indeed, he was a dissident by the 1920s and 30s, and he'd become opposed to what he viewed as revolutionary excess, and he believed that the revolution was tending towards an idolatry of the state. Yet, he had affirmed that revolutionary anti-clericalism aspired to free the church from power and restore the purity of its mission, and also that the state could legitimately divert churches to other ends in the national interest. These were the essential bases of the schismatic movement in the 1920s. Indeed, we also find in 1916 that the Carranza government, of which Cabrera was a part, itself attempted to support a schismatic movement that was launched by a handful of renegade priests in Mexico City. If we think about other revolutionary movements, for example, Zapatism, we also find that there are relatively frequent attempts to Christianize agrarian reform or to set it in a religious context. Antonio Díaz, Soto y Gama is perhaps the most famous example of the Zapatista who invokes primitive Christianity. But I'm going to talk a little more about another one, Miguel Mendoza López Schwerdtfeger, who was the author of the 1915 agrarian law of the Zapatista movement. It's in Mendoza's 1915 book, Tierra Libre, which cited More and Bossuet as well as Smith and Marx, that the interpenetration of religious and agrarian considerations in Zapatism was seen most clearly. Fundamentally, Mendoza sought to redefine property rights through an application of natural law, which he interpreted in socialistic fashion. Indeed, his foundational principle was that God has created man for the land and the land for mankind. The earth, he wrote, was a common patrimony to which humankind was tied in a mystical bond, and from this it followed that private property was a usurpation. In fact, Mendoza averred, private property had created two asymmetrical classes in Mexico, those that produced wealth through work, and those that lived off the rents so generated. This is why Mexicans toiled as hungry pails, and their existence merely had the constitutional appearance of liberty, but was effectively slavery. Mendoza proposed nationalising the land and abolishing rents so that peasants would retain their surplus. He summed up this reform with the Pauline dictum, he who does not work should not eat. I think what's most interesting about his partly socialistic vision is the insistence that Christianity, stripped of prejudice, is itself a revolutionary doctrine. And even in his case, that the revolution is a step towards spiritual as well as economic realization. Let us seek the kingdom of God on earth as well as in heaven, he writes. Or better said, let earth be a preparation for heaven, and society our constant attempt to enact the divine idea. It's pretty spiritually charged stuff. This tradition of reformist Catholicism is the well that Perez drank from also. The 1925 schism departed from a historical view that judged the Roman Catholic Church to be a colonial agent that held Mexico in political and spiritual infancy. Viewing the colony as a dark inquisitorial age, Mexican Catholics outlined a two-stage redemption process. Hidalgo had smashed the shackles of political dependency in 1810, allowing the first rays of light into the colonial dungeon. 100 years later, it will be Perez who will axe the spiritual yoke, unchaining Mexico's conscience after centuries of Babylonian captivity. So spiritual decolonization was the work of the revolution in sum. Arguably, these demands for ecclesiastical self-government and spiritual independence reflect the institutional insecurities of Callismo, the ideology of President Calles' regime, and the insecurities about Mexico's prospects for survival as a nation. This pessimism also succored a paranoid anti-popery. Roman Catholicism was anti-national, state within a state. It blurred civic loyalty, undermined the law, and delayed national consolidation. Schismatics thus call for emancipation from papal tyranny in an autonomous church, ecclesiastically self-governing, not humiliated by foreign priests. Perez's first circular stated that ICANN was founded with the aim of advancing that patriotic ideal that Mexican priests should have the right to occupy in the government of their church those parishes which they in justice deserve. For it causes profound consternation to see how priests of the Spanish and other nationalities occupy the best churches of the Republic, while we are relegated to oblivion in distant places. There's obviously a resentment within the Catholic clergy of some of the Hispanic preferment of the late Porfiriato, and obviously class distinctions as well. A Mexican church for Mexican priests was the counter-slogan that the schismatics advanced. Mexicanization also meant transforming the priesthood's character in line with the Calles regime's developmentalist ideology. Economic development was to be furthered in the church by suppressing sacramental fees in line with the New Testament. This sackcloth ethic also translated Catholicistic economic nationalism into the religious sphere, so that, one broadside went, our money does not enrich Mexico's greatest enemy, the Pope. So you can see that the schism's anti-clerical critiques were really dyads in that they conceive a positive ecclesiastical state which is far more compatible with the goals of post-revolutionary society. Schismatics like liberals before them argued that Catholicism was a moralizing force in national life, provided the priests looked to the Gospels and not their own interests. Doing away with religious taxes, for example, was supposed to reconstitute the relationship between priests and believers and make it more democratic and more consensual. If the schism found historical justification in liberalism and the insurgents, its ecclesiology came from an apostolic Levantine past. The schism mixed effectively rhetorics of purity and progress. It described a kind of anachronistic loop in which the church had to evolve backwards and forwards at the same time, recovering a kind of primitive apostolic incarnation and building itself anew into revolutionary society. This rebirthing rested on an important distinction between creed and discipline. The church as an institution governed by hierarchical rules would be reformed and placed inside the nation state in imitation of the primitive national churches of Jerusalem or at Corinth. As a body of religious truths, however, Catholicism would remain unchanged. Thus, antiquity provided the light for revolutionary moderns to make a defanaticized church compatible with revolution. We can see this very clearly if we look at the organ of the schism, which is called restoration, the title tells it all, which depicted the new movement as a return to the golden age of the primitive church, which is basically the standard trope that we find. Early church history also demonstrated, according to the schismatic organ, that the church was born revolutionary, not just pure. A 1925 sermon preached by Father Benigno Gomez in Mexico City, for example, contrasted Rome's might with Christianity's love of social justice and human fraternity in grand fashion. Gomez first scanned the great firmament of history and saluted the ancient conquerors, Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Scipio, whose feats echoed down the ages. Yet their victories were minute, he wrote, beside those of the humble Galilean, the divine Jesus, the Jewish villager who grew up in a carpentry shop and ended his life on a cross. Yet, as Jesus conquered the human spirit through his teachings, and as these truths passed on to 12 simple fishermen, so revolutionary apostles would triumph in Mexico. We come with the high ideal of the divine Nazarene. We wish to make our beloved fatherland great by means of love, peace, through the fraternal leadership of Mexicans. We do not come to take away our compatriots' religious faith, but to give them the gift of love and the purity of immortal Christ. This sermon concludes. A particular function of Mexican Catholicism besides this was the sacralization of revolutionary reforms. A vernacular liturgy was designed to promote the national language, and the schismatics used that term, which was the obsessive buzzword of the Calles regime, the national language, the idioma nacional, which was obviously Spanish. Most importantly, the Mexican church aimed to moralize land reform, which Callismo had conceived in evolutionary terms as a way of turning landless peasants into more prosperous, dynamic, middling farmers. Especially the schism worked to remove the moral stigma attached to land reform by Roman Catholic priests, who argued that land reform was a violation of the natural right to property, basically a kind of state robbery. Schismatics, in contrast, would moralize the agrarian cause by preaching that agrarianism embodied the Gospels and the meek inherited the earth. The most useful exposition of this idea we find in a pamphlet written by Vicente Lombardo Toledano, who was latterly a Marxist, but at this time was going through a Tolstoyan Christian phase and wrote that agrarianism is essentially Christianity manifested in Mexico. He published an important pamphlet which is called "The Land Reform was not opposed to the teachings of Jesus Christ," printed theological proof defending the land reform as if they were meant to be read aloud in confrontations with Catholic priests and so on. Had a very nice illustration by Diego Rivera of a revolutionary farmer ploughing the field with a sacred heart gazing lovingly down while the wife nurtures the revolutionary baby and the rifle lies on the ground. It's the kind of Christian motif, and the revolutionary farm or the ejido was being set up as a city set upon a hill, a beacon of light in the Mexican countryside. Lombardo also cited various religious sources. He cited extensively from Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching. But he did so in a more radical way. He wasn't trying to justify the timid agrarian reforms that Roman Catholic priests were proposing, but to justify a far more aggressive, expropriatory style agrarianism. Whence the apostle saith, command the rich of this world to give with ease, is the quotation that Lombardo particularly hits upon. He also suggested that land reform would encourage campesinos to feel in contact with the land and with the nation, and it would encourage a spirit of patriotism and productivity. So in sum, we can see that schismatics reached Caillismo's idea of patriotic efficiency, but they drew on Catholic authors and corporatist theology in an attempt to do so. They made a fairly coherent attempt to Christianize the small-holding dreams of revolutionary state builders. For the rest of the paper, I want to try and scan the countryside and give you a kind of radiography of how the schism played out in practice. It came a long way from that rather pure template we've just outlined. I'm going to take evidence from two basic strongholds of the movement. It's always a relative term, but there are places. The first is the Teotihuacan and Texcoco valleys in Mexico State, just 30-40 miles north of Mexico City. And second, what's often called the Totonacapan, really the northern Puebla Sierra and the adjoining Sierra of Veracruz. Within these areas, we find several hundred villages registering Mexican Catholic priests during the church-state struggles of the 1920s and 1930s. We can see that from the Interior Ministry's religious registration records very clearly. I try to supplement that information by using contemporary ethnographies where I can. Fundamentally, Manuel Gamio's study of Teotihuacan, which was published in 1922. The surviving files of the Mexican Church, which are few and far between, alas. And a couple of other sources. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Mexico, which on the principle of know thine enemy kept quite a big and generous file on the schismatic movement. And the General Agrarian Archive of Mexico City, which helps us to overlay the religious and agrarian geographies of the movement. Even between these geographically close and semi-heavily indigenous rural areas, we find that the origins and character of the schismatic movement vary considerably, although there are some constants. Principally, the relatively unchurched quality of the landscape outside the main urban centres as the fundamental precondition. Also, the existence of very strong traditions of local anti-clericalism is another essential precondition. These were all states that we find with very low ratios of priests to parishioners, at least compared to the pro-cristero regions in the west, in which villages rarely saw priests, and often they died unshriven, and the church was not the clergy was not a central feature of local life. There were additionally, both in Teotihuacan and in Veracruz and Puebla, very strong traditions of popular anti-clericalism, which in some cases were allied to traditions of military liberalism dating from the 19th century. We also find a conflictual relationship with organised Catholicism. Efforts to reassert clerical authority in these regions, which had peaked really from the turn of the 19th and 20th century, following the plenary council of Latin American bishops, had generated a significant amount of conflict. By the 1910s and 1920s, we find many local communities were locked in struggles with the clergy, which was adopting a rigid and orthodox pastoral model. Just one kind of baroque example is when Archbishop Vieri Sura of Puebla went on a mission into the Puebla Mountains in 1925. He was disgusted by the heterodox. He went to the village of Jonotla, which is one of our schismatic pueblos that we'll discuss in a little while. He wrote to discuss, he thought it was on a mission to Africa or China. He found the people halfway up a mountain worshipping a stone virgin in a chapel built under a waterfall. You can just see the kind of chasm separating some brands of clerical religion and local religion. Pastoral neglect, costly sacraments, and clerical prohibitions were among religious reasons why indigents and campesinos subscribed to revolutionary Catholicism. A unique and ominous religious occurrence also occurred on the 31st of July 1926, when public religious cult was suspended across Mexico. Can't really overestimate the importance of that. At that point, schismatics became the monopoly suppliers of public religion in Mexico, public Catholicism, public Catholic religion in Mexico. And they were sought out by villagers who needed a priest to keep the religious cycle of their communities going. In that context, we find that some priests and also some communities turned a deaf ear really to the anathemas of the Roman Catholic clergy and engaged the revolutionary religious reform more seriously. Basically, have a tension between official Catholicism and more local saint-based ontologies, if you like. Another particular feature of the schism's development was its association with state-sponsored agrarians, which was close in all of these states, Mexico, Puebla, and Veracruz, where you often find that apostasy follows on the heels of agrarian mobilization. In strict indigenous areas in the Sierra, in Puebla and Pamplona, where we find there is not a strong dichotomy between the hacienda and village, the schism seems to obey a different logic. Probably it's more a defense of costumbre, the kind of indigenous, syncretic religious mode and some of the ethnic and economic structures that sustain it. Turning in more detail to the Mexico State case studies, it's apparent that the schism occurred really in a series of agrarian hotspots north and northeast of Mexico City, in a geographical arc covering the valley of Teotihuacan down to the Texcoco Valley to the east of Mexico City. We find in this area a fairly strong Hacienda Puebla rivalry, but also very strong histories of agrarian tension between communities. Okay. What we find, in fact, is that there's a strong overlap between Mexican Catholicism and agrarian tension in this place. And the fact that religious differences could serve as markers for agrarians who are seeking to escape the clutches of the hacienda and the sacred canopy that Catholicism had thrown over that institution. There was also the fact that revolutionary religion was targeted specifically at agraristas by virtue of its association with CROM, the government labour union, which had ties to agrarianism as well as to the schismatic church. Thus the revolutionary ejido became something of a natural conduit for revolutionary Catholicism. At the same time, where agrarianism represented social mobility and the clergy was associated with the hacienda, some peasants accepted a reformed Catholicism which enshrined essential beliefs in new form, just as they accepted a modified state-dependent model of land occupancy. Nonetheless, the success of the movement depended fundamentally on the size and cohesion of the groups that supported it and the value of their outside connections. In some places we find it became as ultra-minoritarian and it fizzled out very, very quickly. Other times it was backed by influential villages and their clients, usually the agrarianised minority. These movements could last for years if they did not succumb post-1929 to the church and state's efforts to dissolve them. And in a few places we find that a critical mass of campesinos and even former priests supported the schism, which became powerful enough to impose a kind of religious conformity in its communities, and sometimes to endure all the way through the 1930s and even to the present day. I'll give you one example of Coyotepec, which is a place where agrarianized campesinos created a dominant schismatic movement which lasted well into the 1930s and beyond. There's an important distinction here in that the movement was begun by the Roman Catholic priest in July 1926. He simply defied the Roman Catholic episcopate's ban on registering with the authorities and defected to Perez's movement. So the schism enjoyed the uplift of a priest whose authority was already established in the community. Coyotepec also nurtured a historic series of agrarian vendettas against two haciendas, one called Tetla, one called Jalpa, and the nearby pueblo, Teoloyucan, which climaxed annually in bloody conflicts over grazing rights during the rainy season. There were also vicious internal disputes between moderate, so-called anti-agrarista and radical agrarista factions, all of whom were struggling to control the ejido. The anti-agraristas had the upper hand in 1926 and they were supported by the army. Arista, we find these conservatives and clericalists leading troops into Coyotepec, swearing to finish off any sandal-wearing agrarista bandits, as they called them, and assaulting any that they found. Unsurprisingly, Mexican Catholicism became the preserve of the persecuted agrarista faction, for whom it expressed a hard-edged religious agrarian identity. In mid-1927, we find these agraristas seizing control of the church and the town hall, and the vast majority of villages, the municipal president said, becoming adepts of the Mexican Catholic cult. A priest arrived in June, and we find that the Coyotepec was ministered by schismatics throughout the remainder of the Cristero rebellion, until in fact 1929, when the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the Interior Ministry tried to evict the schismatic priest who had been installed. In this case, however, the schismatic radicals, who were led by an agrarista, Hilario Castillo, went on the offensive. First, they forced through provocative agrarian demands at 2 public meetings held in a plaza. They launched a new petition claiming the lands of the 2 haciendas and the hated ejidatarios of Teoloyuca. And they also began to mete out sectarian treatment to those who were left in the wake of the reject agrarian movement. Roman Catholics, we find, protesting in 1930, schismatics had compelled them to attend their services. Anyone who was found experiencing the old religion had been harassed, and some had been thrown into jail. There was a sacramental conformity imposed by schismatics in this case. As some of the distraught traditionalist Catholics wrote, schismatics would sustain their church at any cost, making us believe that the schism is the true religion and that we must recognise it and return to church rather. So here there is a kind of schismatic hegemony, which is based on this religious identity and also control of the ejidal institutions. That's quite a common theme. However, it's also worth bearing in mind that there is a genuine religious dimension to this movement. Religious questions, as well as local politics and agrarian struggles, are also significant. We need to remember here, however, that becoming a Mexican Catholic did not involve conversion. This is not a conversionist faith. Really, it's the recovery of a supposedly different religious state, becoming Catholic in a different way, recovering some of the liberty of movement associated with Catholicism, and of resorting religious beliefs in a new way, only some of them directly connected to religion. The schism's distinction between Roman fanaticism and true religion was very useful in this regard, because it rested on an incomplete rupture with local Catholicism, and hence facilitated a selective approach to religion as well as to revolution, and not outright rejection. First, we find that UCAM's Christian primitivism could offer some spiritual consolation in some terrifyingly concrete situations. Returning to Coyotepec in 1926, for example, where we had the anti-Aguilista faction punishing those who were soliciting land reform. On one report by the schismatic minority in that pueblo relates how Aguilistas were punished by being tied behind horses and dragged through thorn bushes by the hacienda lackeys and their opponents. This torture was performed without compassion, the group of schismatic letter writers reports, even though the broken and bleeding Aguilistas begged for mercy. The families of the detained wept bitterly, the letter continues, as when the beloved mother of Jesu Christi cried for him on seeing the Aguilistas punished for the simple fact that during this presidential period we were granted a handful of land which today gives our children daily bread. The Aguilistas also denounced clericalism's bloodthirsty vipers for violating our sacrosanct revolution. Here there was an agrarian passion of sorts with early Christian motifs, martyrs cut by thorns, serpent in the garden, sadistic soldiers, Mary's crying on Calvary, daily bread, all of which suggests that Aguilistas to some extent cultivated an identity as persecuted Christians to set themselves apart from their enemies. There's a righteousness which has a kind of religious justification in there somewhere. There was, secondly, a natural rapport between political and religious experimentation, in that Mexican Catholicism was not merely revolutionary by association, but by design. Being a schismatic meant rejecting counter-revolutionary elements of Catholic doctrine, basically. Levers of clericalism, which meant hellfire for Aguilistas, the confessional box, were abolished as being incompatible with a loving and just God. These formal differences, again, besides being identity markers, provided a kind of moral escape route for campesinos in a village structure still dominated by Roman Catholic priests. There was, third, an economic factor. Mexican Catholic rights didn't cost them, they were given away for free. That was also intended to popularise the schism by tapping into a generic anti-clericalism. But again, as we said, also to try and provide, to augment campesinos' capacity for accumulation and so forth. The final, most important reason for the schism's popularity was its high tolerance of festive public religion and local religion. Indeed, while Roman Catholic priests banned many extra liturgical exuberances, music, dance, religious plays, pyrotechnics, confetti battles, drinking and the like, all of these featured heavily in Mexican parishes, according to the sources. On the one hand, ICAM's nationalism made it hard for the schism to approve of authentic expressions of Mexican religiosity. Hence, the schism could shade into kind of Baroque revolutionary piety, to accept these things as being genuinely Mexican. In practice, therefore, Mexican Catholicism was often less a Puritan religion than a pro-revolutionary local religion of saints and feasts. Now, I'll try and show this by, first of all, by turning to Manuel Gama's study of the Teotihuacan Valley, which was published in 1922. It rests on a very rigid paganism-orthodoxy dichotomy, which we'll just push to one side and raid the book for ethnographic data on the schism. Gama clearly saw, on the one hand, the integrating function of religious ritual and its role as an identity marker in Mexico State, in the countryside. A Catholic here, he wrote, is someone who goes to Mass, confesses and joins in with all the fusillades and rockets, as well as the dances and primitive representations with which a determined saint is celebrated. Indeed, it's this practice-based local understanding of Catholicism that explains why sudden and strategic shifts in institutional allegiance were possible without provoking a vertiginous sense of rupture. Gama's interviewees, for example, were perplexed by the question of whether they were Catholics or merely professed the Roman Catholic and Apostolic faith. They do not know what to say and end up saying that probably they are just Catholics, Gama writes for us. It's equally important to grasp the importance of saintly cults and tutelary relationships with saintly cults in order to gauge the impact of the suspension of public worship and how that was a bridge for people into this new religious institution also. Here again, I'm going to return back to Gama and pillage his book to give us a sense of the kind of relationship and the protection that people found in their saintly ambassadors at this juncture. Gama found a very interesting alabado or praise, for example, to San Miguel, which was pinned among the flowers and the ex-votos in the village of Xometla in 1922. That was a village which became very, very involved in Mexican Catholicism. Blessed are you, St. Michael, of the heavens and beautiful earth. My God has charged you with the care of my soul, and to be my advocate in the agonies to come. We delight in asking you to spare us from Lucifer, from hell and its power. Viva, viva San Miguel, muera, muera Lucifer. So you see the kind of sense of ontological dread that people have, and the intimacy of the relationship with their patron saints. I think we need to understand that kind of proximity in order to be clear about why it was that the continuation of religious celebrations and festivals was so important during the religious strike of the Catholic clergy at this time. What's also very interesting about Gama's ethnography is its insistence that within local Catholicism, patron saints stood in judgment not just over people and over communities, but over priests. That's a strongly emphasised dimension of his study. And particularly priests who were thought not to have shown sufficient devotion to a particular saint. So his ethnography is full of stories of priests who were unhorsed as they were leaving church after celebrating a particularly perfunctory mass, or if they showed insufficient devotion, years later they become contrite and come back on their knees to a particular village and so on. This kind of normative framework suggests that revolutionary apostasy was conceptually possible within the terms of local Catholicism. It could be conceived as just punishment for religious deprivation or neglect. So the Roman Catholic Church deserved to lose its grip over the flock, and it's abandoned them and their saints. The decision to apostatize in Xometla, which was taken in the context of the suspension of public worship in 1926, suggests as much. At this juncture, the four Juarez brothers, they couldn't be called anything else, as we said, the four Juarez brothers, who were also the village's agrarian leaders, wrote to Archbishop Mora, imploring him not to forget about them, in view of the imminent feast of their patron saint, San Miguel, whose day fell on the 29th of September. In the name of their pueblo, the brothers begged Mora to spare them from the imminent shortage of priests, and prophesied that Xometla would forget about divine worship if not sent a priest. Note that the letter writers merely stressed the lack of priests. There's no reference to the broader political church-state conflict. Simply a reference to the ramifications of a priest's absence in the locality and an implied threat. If you don't continue to keep our ritual cycle going, you will lose that. So here again we sense a contradiction between official and local attitudes to the religious crisis. What was seen at one level as a defence of the Church's canonical integrity, elsewhere was an arbitrary decision which interrupted the flow of local Catholicism. This indeed was the stimulus for change. In 1927 we find that Xometla's representatives wrote to the Archdiocese, "This year we've opted to have a cura of the Mexican cult exercising profession in our pueblo's church." The religious cults ministered by members of the Mexican Catholic Church have not been lacking, and likewise a genuine approval of the whole population, which took to the aforementioned cult with satisfaction because all its acts are in Spanish, a language we more or less understand, and because in this cult all simony is prohibited, which is to say there is a ban on the tariffs established by notorious Romanism, which long exploited our pueblo. So you can see there's a mixture of local religion, anti-clerical tropes about Catholic priests being these kind of black buzzards and so forth. That September, villagers organised their fiesta in honour of San Miguel and sent out thousands of invitations to peasants in neighbouring communities to witness the ceremonies. The feast ran for 5 days, the climax when a bishop and 2 priests turned up off a train or medical station with a town band. There was a mass, there were numerous confessions, and then there was a whole range of profane festivities, fireworks, bell ringing, customary dances of Santiago, so with characters dressed up as Reconquista figures performing historical biblical reenactments, all of which according with the faith of the children of Shometa, the Schism's newspaper proudly reported. But note there was a lot here in discord with the laws governing public worship and Caísmo's dour utilitarian ethos, and even the kind of puritanical thrust of the Mexican Catholic movement itself. The processionals and banquets patronised by priests were illegal acts. If the appeals to anti-fanatical villagers to come and celebrate the overall spectacle, a 5-day feast with drinking and dancing and so forth, was as conducive to sloth as any old regime festival. So really you can see how the schismatic movement has to graft itself onto the kind of contours of local religion. At best it can really juxtapose this vision of liberal Catholicism and what it finds on the ground. It can't truly transform it or can't do so at once. The second case I will look at just before closing is a couple of instances from Pueblo Sierra Norte in the adjoining Papantla Sierra Veracruz, which is a far more indigenous region in which sheep-raising Nahuatl Totonac farmers traded coffee and vanilla also with mestizo head tags. This is another place where the Mexican Catholic Church took a significant root. That was partly because of local political patronage. Large parts of this area were in the thrall of the cacique Gabriel Barrios in the 1920s, an indigenous chieftain in general who gave the schism his tacit blessing, as restorationist uses. We can see that, for example, in the ease with which schismatic priests were able to take over churches in this area, and also the fullness of the ecclesiastical inventories that were recorded when they did so. We find complete lists of all the religious icons and church seals and all of this kind of stuff. There was no stripping of the altars because the people feared that the schismatic was coming. They came in relative peace, all of which suggests a measure of bureaucratic and to some degree popular complicity. In most cases in this area, the prime reason for the schismatic affiliation seems to have been a feeling of religious and also economic insecurity, originating in the suspension of public worship and culminating in the prospects of cancelled fiestas, which would dishonour the community's saintly avatar with unpredictable consequences for crops, commerce and well-being. The absence of priests on feast days, again, is the theme that petitions for Mexican clergy raise again and again. The schismatic Arredondo López reports in 1926 that peasants in Zapatistlan in Puebla in the Sierra constantly demand me to minister the cult of the Holy Catholic religion, whose acts calm the anxiety of these pueblos to receive that cult. In 1927, a schismatic priest received another petition from Cosquihui in Veracruz, asking that a priest belonging to our church go and celebrate the fiestas that take place in that village on 6th of September, because these are ceremonies that our brothers desire. Besides anxiety and desire, economic factors were also important. In Tampico, Alto Veracruz also, people wanted a priest to revive the annual fair in 1929, because the Cristero rebellion had left village commerce in lamentable decadence, and innumerable children had not been baptized for want of a priest. Priests would bring direct benefits to local commerce because of the throng of outsiders there would be to attend formal solemnities and pay homage to the Virgin. Evidently, some communities did not view the 1926 religious crisis in the way that the Roman Catholic hierarchy did, but as an unnecessary interruption. The trauma was not weekly, as in the heavily church Bajío region in the west, where the first Sunday without Mass prompted major affrays in 1926 in the cataclysmic civil war, rather more seasonal in terms of the agricultural and ritual years, and rather more periodic. For indigenous Catholics, the religious strike had compromised the one moment of the year when the presence of a cura, which otherwise was a matter of some ambivalence, was absolutely vital. The Fiesta de Santo Patrono, organised by community mayordomías and brotherhoods. The relief when a priest arrived on time and honoured this cycle was palpable. And again, it contradicts flatly the kind of mythical idea of the Mexican Revolutionary Church as having no support whatsoever. I arrived here without incident, wrote one schismatic, José Luis Lazzarini, after a 1929 visit to the pueblo of Actipan in Puebla. save having had to walk 3 leagues on foot, since the señores who were meant to meet us did not receive our letters because the post officer is an enemy of ours. Yet, I never thought that they, the indigenous people, would prepare such a reception for me, for I do not deserve it. Peals of bells, confetti, the throwing of flowers wherever I walked, in some an overflowing of happiness, and all, as I say, I merited, for on the inside I took pity on these people. For now I do not complain of all these attentions that they give me, since I see my account from the time of the viceroys, with stirrup attendants, domestics, waiters and servants who desire to anticipate my every wish. So for now I am on my insula, in my island. That's probably reference to the island of Baratari that Sancho Panza governs in the Quixote. Latterini's remarks about the obstructive official at the outset also hint at the likelihood that the Mexican church was sometimes accepted because it involved indigenous groups in an autonomous religious institution, one that could circumvent local mestizo officials and parish priests and provide a new kind of political mediation. The schism Iztaquiztla in Puebla clearly obeyed an ethnic as well as an agrarian or religious logic. This village, which was held up as an example of Catholic social action by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Puebla in 1924, joined the Mexican Catholic dissidents when a group of individuals led by Juan Pedro Cancino petitioned for a Mexican priest in 1928, again just in time for their Marian festivals. Yet this move was also part of a campaign against the mestizo officials that assisted the Roman Catholic priest in holding the official line regarding the clerical strike. When the municipal president refused to register a young schismatic in early December that year, claiming he had no government order, Cancino and his supporters denounced the ayuntamiento to the Interior Ministry for violations of the leyes de cultos. The ringleaders of this obstructionist clique were apparently the mayor, the municipal secretary, and his sister, all marshalled by a Spanish cura, Bonifacio Balbuena. This group had armed itself and went about the streets shouting "Viva Cristo Rey" and almost on one occasion lynched the schismatic who had to flee. In June 1929, however, as the festive calendar entered another devout phase, the feast of John the Baptist, pro-schismatic villagers appointed Cancino as special commissioner for the inhabitants of this villa, excluding the so-called people of reason, los llamados de razón, which was to say, the Hispanic element. This distinction, Cancino wrote, was necessary in order that the people pompously called de razón do not frustrate those who I represent, who wish to feast on the day of our patron saint in accordance with our customs. This time, the schismatic commissar found an ally in Iztaquiztla's agrarian representative who firmly seconded the appeals of my pueblo to give the temple to a Mexican church priest. Here we find a sharp distinction between the pueblo's community land and the clients of a religious patron and the municipality, Hispanic clericalized caucus. And we can see how the Mexican church was utilized in the struggle really to reframe Indian religious practice in a more revolutionary way as a legal and popular right that had been trampled upon by conservative and foreign priests and elites. On rare occasions, finally, it is possible to connect the schism to the revindication within Catholicism of syncretic forms of indigenous religion, for instance, the veneration of tutelary mountain deities or fertility cults of some kind. Unfortunately, you might expect a lot of the sources are dead silent on this, so we have to press them quite hard, but they can give us tentative glimpses if we juxtapose them with ethnographic data in particular. In this vein, as French anthropologist Guy Stressa-Peon notes, many Nawa and Totonac villages prior to 1940 observed festivals commemorating mystical tutelary ties with a mountain or pair of mountains, which were held to be filled with water and possessed of curative powers. As the source of all fertility, moreover, these summits were endowed with female as well as male attributes, as if husband and wife, or in the case of a unitary mountain, cults given hermaphrodite qualities. These pictures are symbolically represented by great big wooden drums, which are horizontal in the case of the female deity and vertical in the case of the male deity, were kept in church and played on specific feast days by trained religious specialists or learned men called tlatlacue. On these occasions, Stressa-Peon tells us, Nahuas and Totonacs would ascend the mountain or visit a shrine under the direction of the seers and healers to give sacrificial offerings of turkey, pulque, beans, etc. to their deity. Yet Stressa-Peon also notes strong ethnographic and archaeological evidence, buried drums with plaques, to the effect that numerous villages in the 1920s began burying their drums and suppressing their festivals. Stressa-Peon attributes this abandonment to economic modernization and the effects of religious persecution, which had affected the status of Roman Catholic clergy, but also of some village sages and village seers. If that is correct, events at the Marian shrine at Honotla, the poem we talked about a while ago, an ancient Totonac village enclosed by coffee and banana plantations. The events assume a more political character within the framework of village life, and they show how revolutionary schism could serve as a useful Catholic surrogate for furthering syncretic practices. Here the schismatic José Emeterio Valdés registered to minister in the main parish church in 1926, and then in March 1927 in the so-called Santuario del Peñón, the Shrine of the Rock. This second building was a rough-hewn edifice which Totonac Indians themselves had constructed halfway up a huge rock dominating the village, overlooking a mountain torrent crashing on the canyon floor. The rock was dedicated to the Guadalupe. The chapel housed a stone image of the Virgin, 8 inches tall, which was found after sections of rock face collapsed before the eyes of a small boy in October 1922. The timing of Valdés's registration as minister of this Marian shrine was also significant, since it clearly coincided with the spring agricultural cycle and associated festivals. This assertion of Marianism also featured indigenous elements and binaries connected to fertility and to agriculture. The immanence of stone, as shown in a tutelary water deity inhabiting a rock, a female Christian figure identified with a male agrarian or pluvial deity. The name of the rock in Náhuatl was Tlacotequepec, which means the home of Tlaloc, the Náhuatl god of rain and the community's mythical founder. In social terms, moreover, the Marian cult expressed defiance against mestizo interlopers associated with the local coffee economy, the parish church, and clergy, and official Catholicism. The schism thus arrived in a village where religious ties were dividing and where sectarian divisions overlaid the stresses of economic change. While mestizo planters observed the sacramental piety in the parish church, indigenous farmers placed blood-soaked corn cobs beside the Virgin in a chapel under a waterfall. In this context, the Guadalupe Tlaloc innovation was something of a defence of a millennial and corn-based economy. In the schism we find force headlong into this ethnic division within the community. All the records that Valdés reports, he says that I'm never invited to minister to the mestizo people in the parish church. The only people who care and come to Mass are indigenous people. The only support for religious cult in this place, he writes, are the indigenous folk. In conclusion, recent scholarship conceptualizes the revolution as a hegemonic process in which the contours of the state were negotiated between elite and popular actors. The often Catholicism, as we were discussing earlier on in the workshop today, is viewed simply as an object of liberalism, in this case of the revolution, a jagged reef or a stumbling block threatening the process. The history of the Mexican church points to a more dynamic set of interactions between revolutionary politics and local Catholicisms, and adds an additional layer of complexity in that it reveals triangular negotiations involving church, state, and people. From 1926, peasants in numerous pueblos tried to negotiate a path through the minefield of religious politics at local level, and given the unusual opportunities presented by the church-state crisis, found ways to bargain political loyalty for a measure of religious autonomy. Thus, religion could form part of local revolutionary culture, as peasants created new forms of political, religious, and sometimes ethnic identity incorporating religious attitudes. At another level, the revolutionary schism helps us to understand what became of Mexico's tradition of liberal Catholicism, its 19th century tradition of liberal Catholicism. It reminds us that there was a constitutional clergy in 1910, as in 1860, as in 1821. This body used Holy Writ and religious history to attack the official church, whether to revalidate the rights of a national church vis-à-vis Rome, the rights of parish priests in ecclesiastical affairs, or the rights of citizens involved in social reforms. But most of these matters were not revolutionaries in a theological sense. Rather, they formulated a critique of church authority from inside the Catholic fold, one that was supposed to bridge religious and revolutionary values. If it was possible to blend revolutionary social engineering aspects of local religion in a way that was acceptable to village Catholics, the schism nevertheless failed to Christianize the revolution on the terms it set for itself. There was meant to be a Weberian affinity between Perez's apostasy and the modern citizens the regime wanted peasants to become. Instead of creating a national reformed Catholicism, however, the schism tended to take root in relatively unchurched villages in the highlands or along the Gulf, where it built on older traditions of liberalism and saint-based religion. The schism in sum was conceived as a kind of religious decompression chamber where Catholics could shed their fanatical tendencies and re-emerge as conscious believers and revolutionary citizens. Yet it rarely, if ever, affected that kind of spiritual uplift. For most people, the revolutionary schism meant Catholicism with a hydros, without fees and without hellfire, but with festive paraphernalia and miracles and virgins, without overbearing clericalism, but with the saints. Schismatic religion often became a sectarian weapon in inter- or even intra-community feuds. Oftentimes it was a way to assert community control over saint-based religious systems, if not the material base that underwrote them. To schismatize then was to become revolutionary whilst holding on selectively to Catholic beliefs, and to avoid spiritual crisis by recourse to new and experimental religious forms. Either way, Perez's movement found relative success not as a pristine national church, but as a local, even an ethnic one. At the same time, the schism resembled an informal point of contact between the state and parts of civil society, like some new evangelical movements, and thus helps us to join the dots between revolutionary religious policy and the development of religious pluralism in post-revolutionary Mexico. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthew, for that, and thank you for an interesting talk. I'm sure people have questions for Matthew. We got any from the floor? Helga.
You talk about the schismatic church, schismatic religion. How would you say that in Spanish?
Schismatics don't readily self-identify as schismatics because they claim that they have the truth. I'm using schismatic because it comes from schismatico in Spanish, which is the word which is used primarily, given that most of the sources are not written by the schismatics themselves. The descriptions tend to be projected through the sources of the Mexican government or the Roman Catholic Church, and the word that gets used is schismatico. If you try and improve on schismatico, and I agree it's a defective thing and it's explained away in the footnote, then you end up in a terrible kind of semantic labyrinth, because then you have to divide Mexican Catholics and Mexican Roman Catholics, since the Roman Catholics that the schismatics oppose are themselves Mexicans. You end up in a kind of semantic labyrinth from which it's hard to emerge. On the other hand, as far as Roman Catholics are concerned, Mexican Catholics are bad Catholics. As far as Mexican Catholics are concerned, Roman Catholics are bad Catholics and bad Mexicans. So it's hard to find a perfect and neutral token that can express that idea. So in the end, I stay with schismatic and schismatic as generally a pragmatic mission. But it does also reflect the kind of the tone of the sources in which the vast majority of descriptions are not generated from the movement itself. So schismatic gets kind of bandied around a lot. And in some places we do find that the schismatic will reluctantly accept that token, just as a way of expressing a difference, although the preferred term is Católicos Mexicanos.
Just to follow up on that, so when you said you worked with the agrarian archives, what would you find there that would make you think, okay, these are cismáticos or católicos? Does it say nosotros somos católicos mexicanos?
Yeah. Occasionally, the agrarian reform, as you know better than anyone in this room, the agrarian reform files are bureaucratic instruments designed to achieve the goal of distributing land and recording the history of the land more so than the history of the people who live on the land in some ways. What you do find in the agrarian reform archives are complaints, because the agrarian bureaucracy is also a path to the top, as is well known. It's a big bureaucratic structure, so you can use it as a kind of sounding board. You can write a letter complaining about the villages in the next community who do what the Roman Catholic Court says, and they throw stones at us when we try and take over our heath. So you can definitely find those kind of reports, but really looking for names and for organisations. So it's amazing how often you can cross-reference those things. The other source of documentation, while we're on the sources, is the other big source is the AGM, the National General Archive, particularly because it contains the files of the Interior Ministry. And because the Mexican government was so interested in regulating religion, especially Roman Catholic religion, and squeezing it, they demanded very detailed records of religious personnel. So for any individual to stand up and celebrate a mass in a church in Mexico in this period, in the 1920s and for a long period of the 1930s, they required a license. That was the whole crux of the problem, that Roman Catholic priests would not solicit that license, because that was thought to be a state imposition of the church. Mexican Catholic priests were quite willing to do that. So you find all the names of Mexican Catholic priests and the dates in which they took possession of specific churches. In fact, more than that, you find these nice little civic liturgies in which they stand in the municipal presidency and sign a book. They swear allegiance to the 1857 Constitution and all of this stuff. And they choose 10 vecinos to take care of the church and all of these things. So you know who the schismatics are, you know who their immediate supporters are, because all the people sign the document. You have to be a bit careful, obviously, about names on documents of that sort. Then you can cross-reference those things. It's amazing how often participation in agrarian reform in these kind of places dovetails with participation in revolutionary religion. It's really surprising. I mean, it's just it's another way for them to distinguish themselves from Roman Catholics who oppose land reform, to escape the kind of moral sanctions of the Roman Catholic clergy and all the things that I mentioned in the paper. But the levels of consistency are quite high, surprisingly high.
Helen?
I mean, almost by definition, this is a national church, and that's what it's called, and as you pointed out, its impact is less than national, it's more local. I'm wondering whether it registered at all beyond Mexico. I mean, is there some discussion of it elsewhere in Latin America or in the US that you've come across, and if so, how is it perceived?
There are a couple of questions there, I guess, in that I can only think of one other country where this specific group registered, and that was in the US. I haven't had yet time to drive around and find them, but apparently there are still some groups in Texas that still are part of this organisation. And again, I wouldn't claim to have to know why exactly this brazenly nationalistic religious group should appeal to Mexicans in the US, apart from the generic thoughts that maybe their Mexican identity had become more important to them in the act of migration, and that therefore, like there's a Polish National Catholic Church in the US and various other ethnic groups have national Catholic bodies, this might have appealed to them. Also, I mean, there appears to be a correlation at times between migration and the Crom. So some groups of labourers immigrating en masse, so they might have taken it with them. But those are the only two things I can think of off the top of my head that might explain it. Some graduate student in Austin should be sent round in a car to find out the answer to this question maybe. But your broader question is like, do you find this elsewhere? You find this all over Latin America. I mean, even the Chavez regime a few years ago produced the Iglesia Católica Reformada de Venezuela, because there was a little Chavista kind of movement that appeared. So it's a very common thing. Roberto Di Stefano writes about the Rivadavia Church in Buenos Aires, and there are various other examples that you could think of. So movements of this ilk, which are nationalistic and kind of also to some extent reformist, but within the bounds of a Catholic tradition, are very, very common. And they crop up particularly after independence, when a long tradition of reformist Catholicism, which is present in the Bourbon period, interlinks with the need to create liberal nation states and the institutions that go with it.
My question also was about whether it registers in discussions about what is going on within Mexico outside, and perhaps in say, Argentine or Peruvian Catholic periodicals. I mean, is it something that drives debate on what's happening with Catholicism in Latin America?
It appears in Rome. You find evidence of it obviously in Rome. In Latin America, they were very concerned with this, especially when it appeared that some elite Catholic figures might waver. That obviously concerned them greatly, because if you can get a bishop to jump ship, then you've got a church that can reproduce itself and create more bishops, which is obviously the thing that they most wish to prevent. More broadly in Latin America, I'm not sure, but certainly in the US, in fact, a predecessor of mine at the University of Texas went down and interviewed a few people involved in this, so probably interested in Protestant opinion more than anybody in the US. Right. We were talking about kind of defunct secularization narratives earlier on today, and people at that time were thinking very much in terms of getting them out of the Roman Catholic, at least we'll get them to the Mexican Catholic Church, and then the next step will be when we send our Baptist and Methodist missionaries down to Mexico, they will take refuge in those institutions. So you get those kind of echoes.
That's exactly one of the things I wanted to ask you. Just before putting that question, just a comment. The language which I learned from you that is used in talking about the schismatics and is decidedly odd compared with that used in most similar situations in church history. The normal contradistinction would be schismatics and people in communion with Rome. And one wouldn't talk about Roman Catholics as a church. We don't take it as a given. But that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. If I understood you correctly, all of the practices of the schismatics were in terms of church discipline and practice. They were not fundamentally doctrinal differences. So, for example, saying Mass in Spanish is not a theological aberration. It's a question of church discipline, and has been used at different periods in the history of the church. The one thing that did seem to strike at a theological point, and this is where I'm not sure I understood you correctly, were you saying that confessionals were taken out and burnt because that sacrament was conducted in a different fashion, or that the idea of confession was attacked as being not a sacrament, not needed, something that was abolished? And if that's the case, if there was that degree of doctrinal change, I was going to ask whether there is a correlation between the penetration of American Protestantism and the areas where the schismatics operated, whether it has been more successful in the decades since the period, up to the present time, than in areas which were, for example, dominated by the cristeros. Theoretically, one would expect that. And is that in practice the case? And just a further comment that David Brady's comment about total proletariat is okay, but there have always been prelates, of course, who took decidedly pro-popular stands. And I mentioned this just a nod in his honour, because it happens that tomorrow is the 1000th year anniversary of the killing of the Bishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, Alphege, who was put to death by the Danes in Grange. And the reason that he was killed by the Danes was that, having been captured by them, the Danes wanted a large ransom, and he forbade his flock, his people, to raise that money. Said they need the money themselves. I'm not going to have the Anglo-Saxon populace paying money for my freedom, which they need for their own purposes. And the Danes didn't like this, and there's much more to say about that. But in a fury, they killed him with an axe. And that happened on the 19th of April, 1012, 1,000 years ago tomorrow.
Well, that's an amazing anniversary, but I can just try and answer your questions. I guess the confessionals, the burning confessionals, that's really something you associate with the secular brands of the revolution. That was something they did as they marched south and pulled confessional boxes out of churches and would set fire to them. Why they did it? I mean, it was partly just an attack on a visible, what was particularly a visible instrument of control by Roman Catholic priests. They would be privy to secrets of families and so forth. It was an ideological edifice that had to be destroyed. You find that fundamentally, as I say, as an act of retribution, it's taken by secular revolutionists. The constitutions are very good at that. Lots of the constitutions generally, you can almost follow the actions, you can go south and you trace them. The schismatics don't do that. They don't insist on confession the way that the Roman clergy do, but they don't abolish the sacrament, as far as I'm aware. I've never seen them refer to that. So it remains.
So confession did exist, but done in the open air, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for example, is done now in the army. If a Catholic padre in Afghanistan, I mean, I saw photographs of that about 2 months ago in a magazine, and they don't set up confessionals.
Yeah.
What happens is the priest sits on a chair, and squaddies who are Catholics come and kneel by the chair. But the sacramental thing is identical. It's merely the architecture of it that changed. And what I was asking you was whether which had changed.
Yeah, that is the formulation. I mean, they're obsessed all the time with purity of their doctrine. That's one of their big tropes. When they try, for example, when they try to resolve the problem of an apostolic succession, they start entering into negotiations with old Catholic groups around Europe and around the US.
Oh, that's much trickier, because that does hit at doctrinal points, because they're the followers of Deflinger who broke away after the First Vatican Council, and there are doctrinal points.
Yeah, the principle would be the doctrinal dogmatic statements of the Vatican Council about primacy and so forth, and infallibility.
Amongst others, yes.
Yeah, those are the fundamental things. So those would be the areas of theological disagreement, if you like. But I can't think of any others. In terms of the sacraments that are offered to the believers, they would be the same.
Do you think the reason that these things didn't develop is because the time period was just too short? Because they were not operating for very long. Whereas, for example, like somewhere like the Church of England, which has existed now for 400 years, you get whilst King Henry VIII, who made the break with Rome, was absolutely insistent on theological orthodoxy, and that's why all our money. I mean, I don't know if the Latin Americans know that, but if you take some money out of your pocket, you'll see that it has fid def on it. And that stands for Defensor Fidei. And the reason that that's on is it's a title that was given by the Pope to Henry VIII, because he wrote a work, Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, I assert the existence of 7 sacraments, against Luther. In other words, Henry VIII was totally orthodox, and it's after that that there began to be doctrinal change in the Church of England, to the point now, for example, that you don't actually have to believe in God to be an Anglican minister. The example is a man called Don Hewkett at the University of Cambridge, who is an ordained Anglican, who holds that God doesn't have an objective existence, but is a kind of idealization of everything that is thought to be good and useful for men to believe in.
It's possible to tell us that answer to your question about duration. Yeah, I mean, it might have developed, but it's not Trojan horse Protestantism. I mean, I don't believe that. I find no evidence for that. The people who come are Catholic priests and Catholic faith that have a particularly grudge, historical or conjunctural with the Roman Catholic Church at that moment. Also, it does feed out this very long history of reformist Catholicism in the Mexican frontiers. So I think it probably would have continued in that vein more likely. I mean, it could have developed in a different direction. But there's no, I don't see the germ of it in what I see now. It lasted in the 1920s and 1930s, and you don't find evidence of that. The one exception was one Anglican missionary in Mexico expressed interest in a sabbatical from his mission and was allowed to second himself for a time with this movement. He was then cut off. His missionary stream of funding was ended. So that's the only link. The Catholic propaganda at the time was very big on the idea that this is kind of a Protestant fifth column. But I don't see actual evidence of that.
Trevor, you have a question?
Yeah. My impression is that the schism doesn't really have long enough to develop a consistent or a powerful ideology of its own because it's so short-lived. That might actually make some sense of what schismatics were actually doing in the way that perhaps the revolutionary state itself did in the form of indigenismo and mestizaje, which was their way of reconciling this powerful modernizing project that the government developed through the 1920s and 1930s, and the reality of the vast diversity of the people that it was trying to get to. And you can see the kind of parallel perhaps between this, to the extent that there was a kind of purifying or restorative thrust in the among the leaders, at least, of the schismatic church, with the experiences that you've described to us, which really don't seem that purifying at all. It seemed to take the form of these kind of lowly priests going out to villages and just seeing who will take them in, basically, and doing pretty much what the local people tell them to do, rather than what most of the Catholic priests did do and still do, which is to try at least to impose some kind of stamp on what's going on, although only ever with partial success. But in any case, I don't know if that would be fair. In other words, do you see really much of an attempt to rationalise the experiences of these clergy, or does it not really go on long enough for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the duration obviously is a difficult question. We've got to remember that when this movement is say there's also a religious war going on in large parts of Mexico, so there are significant parts of Mexico where it would simply be a death sentence to be involved in this kind of project. So in the end, the schism does kind of gravitate to indigenous areas where there's a huge demand for religion for priests at specific times of the year. But the kind of demand for the doctrinal precision maybe may not be that great, so the schism wraps itself around that. I think the kind of strongest element, as you say, is this kind of the purification trope, the kind of golden age.
It's just, I mean, I can see that coming from the church leaders, but it's just very hard to see any kind of purification in what's actually going on.
Yeah, you don't see much of it. I mean, you don't. I mean,
it's almost the opposite.
Yeah, it's a kind of meeting of more elite style anti-clericalism with a kind of popular festive kind of religion with its own kind of anti-clericalism. That's where the synthesis occurs. I mean, that's where the movement has remained strong. There are large parts of the West End where you find this movement still flourishing today. In fact, if anything, that tendency has become more accentuated over time. After the 1930s, for example, the kind of sacralizing the revolutionary reformers bit tends to fall away more. Cardenas generalizes the natural. There's no need for it to have this kind of moral superstructure imposed on it. So what you find as time goes by, that the Mexican Catholic Church does become a pantheon for local religious devotions. And you see that in large parts of Veracruz, in Tuxtla Gutierrez, for example, in Chiapas, where there's a cult of San Pascual Bailon, which is an old Franciscan devotion. That's the direction that it's headed in.
You could almost compare it to the 16th century, you know. The Spanish missionaries were going into the New World, and they have the same problem.
Indeed,
anything and everything. And they try and accommodate themselves to it in practice, while during the course of the century, some of these missionaries were actually rationalising this whole procedure and trying to accommodate it. But again, I don't think you get to that point. No,
I mean, what's also interesting is that in this time, I'm not saying that this one organisation could bear that in an analytical way, but if you look at the registries of religious groups who appear in Mexico during the 1920s, especially the mid-1920s, you get this sudden profusion of new groups. I mean, it's quite strange. All these requests for licenses that involve Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Mennonites, every kind of denomination you can think of. So I remain persuaded that the revolution does kind of create a crack in the religious field in Mexico that allows for a lot of diversification. You can see a fragment of that here. You can see that even indigenous Catholics, who are, for all they're dismissed by our friend Wood, who are constantly beginning because they're just Stone Age peasants don't know what they're doing. You can see that even in little villages, and no matter how mediated that kind of relation might be, you can start to see that indigenous Catholics start to behave as kind of proto-consumers, that they can compare these two religious products and decide which one they like better. So in that sense, the schism does fit into a much broader pattern of change. And that's always so was with the kind of 1950s and 1960s, you see that. And I'm sure that the revolution should be given more significance as a driver of religious change in Mexico. And this movement is part of that.
And one final question from Victoria.
Would you think that this is a failed attempt to create a secular religion? And if not, do you think that the failure was due to the national nature of Catholicism? And on the other hand, if this is not the case, then it could be related to previous Hispanic projects of having the bonds with Rome, but keeping the doctrine pristine in this fashion of recreating primitive pristine.
I think your second formulation is absolutely correct. I mean, it goes. If you read Restauración and all of the more educated publications, they all talk about the lineage all the time. They're obsessed with it, partly because they're being attacked as religious charlatans, or that they have no roots, or there's nothing serious about their project. They're very keen on that idea, so they appeal to the old Catholics, as I've said. They stress ad nauseum their connections to the liberal history of Mexico, and specifically to the kind of religious experiments that Melchor Ocampo pioneered, to Father Mora, Fray Servando, and all the people I mentioned in the introduction. They stress that this is the lineage from which they come. And so there's a kind of there's a mythical Christianity which they ultimately originate, but as these things have been tried in Mexico. The one thing they don't really do is track it all the way back to the Bourbon reforms. There's an obvious reason for that. It's an anti-Hispanic movement, so they don't really want to be giving credit to Bourbon Prida. So it's their lineage starts with Hidalgo. I should have brought some pictures, because Perez is an old fellow. He combs his hair. He's got this kind of Hidalgo-esque look about him, but he thinks he's the revolution's answer to Hidalgo. So this is self-characterization.
Thank you. I think we'll bring it to a close there. And just before we thank Matthew and head next door for some refreshments, we've got some wine and nibbles that you're always welcome to come and have with us. I'd just like to remind everyone if they can sign their name on the attendance sheet as they go out, if you haven't done so already, if that's very important for us here. So please come and join us for some wine next door, and just give a round of applause to Matthew. Thank you very much.